Within 1984, the Ministry of Love is the place where the disobeyers of the party go to and where they are brainwashed to believe the way of the party. O'Brien held up the fingers of his left hand with the thumb concealed. There are 5 fingers there. Do you see 5 fingers? Yes. But they do not do it with the persuasion. They use torture methods. There is pain coming, a new kind of pain, and you endure that kind of pain until you accept the way of the party, just as Winston did in 1984. In the end, he realized. He loved Big Brother. George Orwell not only predicted these torture places, but they exist today in a much larger scale. Abu Ghraib is a notorious torture prison 20 miles west of Baghdad, where around 50,000 men and women were contained in 12 by 12 cells all at once. Approximately 13 years ago, Abu Ghraib was redone to be a U.S. military prison. They held thousands of prisoners, men, women, and teens, many of whom have been picked up in random military sweeps and at highway checkpoints. They fell into 3 loosely defined categories: common criminals, security detainees suspected of crimes against the coalition, and small number of suspected high-value leaders of the insurgency against the coalition forces. Between October and December of 2003, Major General Antonio M. Taguba said in his 50-page report that there had been sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. On several occasions within Abu Ghraib, Taguba even listed the wrongdoings, which are quite disturbing: breaking chemical lights and pouring the phosphoric liquid on detainees, pouring cold water on naked detainees, beating the detainees with a broom handle and a chair, threatening male detainees with rape, allowing a military police guard to stitch the wound of a detainee who was injured after being slammed against the wall in his cell, sodomizing a detainee with a chemical light and perhaps a broomstick, and using military working dogs to frighten and intimidate detainees with threats of attack, and in one instance, actually biting a detainee. There were photographs and witnesses that proved this torture to be true. While George Orwell does not go this deep into what occurs within the Ministry of Love, he leaves it very open as to what actually occurs when they detain someone. There are no limits as to what they are allowed to do. The Abu Ghraib detainees, specifically men from Iraq, were forced to perform sexual acts with one another as a form of torture. Prisoners would be forced to wear minimal clothing or women's undergarments within their cells and handcuffed to the doors, with 0 running water or ventilation for 3 days at a time. It was said that these punishments were asked of the prison guards by the military intelligence. In 1984, people detained in the Ministry of Love were tortured in a way that would get them to believe the way of the party. But in Abu Ghraib, the torture was said to be a way to get the detainees to turn in their fellows. There were also many prisoners that were held in Abu Ghraib, but that were not on record. This led to many innocent Iraqis to be wrongly detained. General Jeffrey Milne, the previous commander of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, became the new head of the Iraqi prison system. Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, similar to Abu Ghraib, lies on the Bay of Guantanamo in Cuba. This facility often goes by the name Gitmo, which is the same name as the naval base. The detention center opened after the 9/11 attacks, and it was intended to be a place where suspects in the war on terror could be interrogated. In Gitmo, Muslim militants and suspected terrorists were not only interrogated but indefinitely imprisoned. Gitmo's peak was in June 2003, where there were 684 detainees, the youngest only being 14 years old. These hundreds of prisoners from 49 different nations ended up being held captive without a charge or any legal means to challenge their detention. Many people who were detained were sold to the army with the false accusation that the people being sold were Al-Qaeda operatives or a part of other supposed terrorist groups. Violations of legal human rights were said to have occurred, such as torture or abusive treatment within the detention center. President George W. Bush stated that the U.S. had no obligation to grant any constitutional rights to these prisoners because the location of the prison base lies outside of U.S. territory. In 2006, the federal courts were denied access of hearing petitions from foreign detainees. But in 2008, the court deemed that the detainees were allowed the right to challenge their detentions in the federal courts. Despite the court's decision, several prisoners who had been cleared for release in other countries or for transfer to their home countries continued to be detained, either because no country would accept them or because their home countries were deemed too volatile to guarantee their secure imprisonment. Several international human rights organizations would repeatedly condemn the camp of human rights violations such as torturous interrogation methods, but Bush's administration claimed that all detainees were well cared for and that their interrogation methods were not torturous. On January 22, 2009, President Barack Obama ordered the closure of Guantanamo Bay. The closure was delayed due to the opposition of Republicans and some Democrats within the Congress, that putting the detainees in U.S. prisons would place national security at risk. Recently, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that revives overseas black site prisons, which were CIA programs where terrorist suspects were interrogated and tortured. Those practices that were widely condemned within Bush's time are to be re-examined. Trump also plans to keep Guantanamo Bay open. These two detention centers and the new black sites show a trend in wrongful torturing by setting them outside of U.S. territory in order to perform any acts they deem necessary on the detainees, such as torture, imprisonment without trial, and essentially violating constitutional human rights. There have been protests with people who dress in prison uniforms with bags over their heads with signs that speak volumes. Protesting is a great way to spread awareness that all individuals can do. This injustice of basic human rights can be put to a stop by everyone being aware of the injustice and fighting for what is right. When these facilities were established, the press advocated that these interrogation methods were necessary, but the people were not getting the full story. The Fairness Doctrine that was passed in 1954 allowed the people to get both sides of every story in all major news outlets, but was repealed in 1987 by Ronald Reagan. Now it is no longer deemed necessary to show both sides of every story within the press, allowing biased public agendas to be set. Reinstating the Fairness Doctrine would make the public aware of the complex nature of these problems and why suspects should be afforded the same rights as suspects in our country. And this can only be monitored on American soil. The government needs to be cautious with the people they feel the need to detain, but violating others' rights in order to protect our country is terrorism in itself. Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's a really easy way. Stop participating in it.